Picture this. It's actually Canada that's just handed the United States a firm ultimatum, turning the tables entirely on what most observers assumed would happen. Canada, after all, operates with roughly 1/10 the gross domestic product, 1/10 the overall population, and 1/10 the defense spending of the much larger nation it's now laying down conditions for. Mark Carney stepped forward at a podium in Ottawa and outlined a detailed list of demands aimed directly at the American president, complete with a tightly attached deadline. 59 days exactly, not 60, not 30, not 90. That precise figure immediately signaled to every seasoned trade expert that this wasn't some vague political gesture designed for headlines. It carried a technical, almost mechanical weight, linked to binding legal structures and existing agreements that would trigger automatically on day 59, ready or not for whoever sat in the Oval Office. And inside the White House, in those private rooms where careful strategies are normally crafted and steady confidence projected, the atmosphere didn't stay calm or deliberate as you'd expect from the world's most powerful government facing pressure from a smaller neighbor. What surfaced instead was genuine panic, the raw, visible kind that spilled out to multiple news organizations within the first 48 hours. Urgent sessions were called, yet they produced no clear action plans. Rival factions released conflicting guidance by the same afternoon. 3 separate policy concepts were developed simultaneously, each one effectively canceling out the viability of the other 2. A senior advisor was overheard in a hallway exchange with a colleague, a conversation that leaked to the Washington Post almost immediately, noting how the team had invested 18 full months building a plan around bargaining advantages that had suddenly evaporated. Those advantages were gone for good. The agreements were winding down, and the administration didn't have a full 59 days of workable solutions ready. They had maybe 11 days worth at most. Those 59 days represent a strict countdown clock, not a flexible bargaining session, or a political tactic that could be stretched, adjusted, or walked back through quiet diplomacy. It's ticking toward the exact simultaneous end of 7 major categories of Canadian deliveries to the United States: energy resources, critical minerals, lumber supplies, agricultural goods, water provisions, automotive parts, and pharmaceutical ingredients. These are the everyday essentials that American manufacturing depends on, along with construction projects, farming operations, defense manufacturing, electricity generation, and healthcare systems across the country. On day 59, the contracts expire. The commitments end, and the advance arrangements Canada has already secured with international customers in Japan, the European Union, South Korea, India, the United Kingdom, and Mexico immediately take priority. The supplies don't vanish. They simply redirect to partners who offered more attractive terms during the 18 months, when the United States relied on tariffs instead of talks. Day 60 isn't framed as any kind of threat. It is simply a fixed date on the calendar, and calendars don't pause or shift based on who occupies the presidency. Warren Buffett described this 59-day ultimatum as one of the most cleverly executed uses of a deadline he'd witnessed in more than 60 years of studying competitive business environments. He explained that it highlighted a fundamental truth most leaders in politics or commerce only recognize when it's already too late. Deadlines function as the great equalizer. On ordinary days, sheer size carries enormous weight, economic scale, military reach, all of it. The largest economy can push, intimidate, coerce, and overwhelm, but the moment a contract reaches its expiration, none of those advantages apply. At that point, the only real question is whether the supplier chooses to renew. And the answer depends far less on how powerful the buyer happens to be than on how the buyer behaved while the previous agreement was in force. Now let's examine the actual conditions Canada has put forward, the 5 specific requirements that mirror the original demands from Trump, but reversed in every meaningful detail. Once you understand exactly what those 59 days are counting down to, why the contract endings were deliberately synchronized, how replacement buyers were already lined up and committed, what the true nature of the White House alarm looked like, and what Buffett revealed about the gap between negotiable political timelines and unyielding structural deadlines, it becomes obvious why this moment isn't merely another twist in the trade dispute. This is the instant the entire confrontation concluded, not through extended negotiations, but through the unstoppable movement of a clock. Hit subscribe right now because that clock is actively ticking. The countdown is locked into legal and structural realities that cannot be extended by any executive order or intense diplomatic push. And so far, the administration hasn't identified even one workable countermeasure that could be rolled out in the time remaining. That's reportedly why 3 senior economic advisors have urged the president to accept the proposed terms, though he's chosen not to follow their counsel. Let me walk you step by step through the dramatic shift in power balance. Because the real heart of this story isn't the ultimatum itself, it's the complete reversal that made the ultimatum possible in the first place. 18 months ago, Donald Trump held every conceivable form of leverage in the relationship between the two countries. that leverage wasn't theoretical. It was deeply embedded and concrete, woven into the physical and financial systems connecting the economies at every level. Access to the American market served as Canada's primary economic lifeline. Roughly 75% of Canadian exports flowed south, with no other destination even coming close in volume. American energy networks were engineered specifically to receive Canadian resources through pipelines heading south, grid links supplying electricity to U.S. homes, and refineries built to handle Canadian crude grades. Those supplies had nowhere else to go because the supporting infrastructure for alternative routes simply didn't exist at the time. American financial networks managed the overwhelming majority of Canadian transactions. The dollar served as the default currency for trade. U.S. capital markets provided the main liquidity for Canadian institutions. Defense cooperation through NATO, NORAD, and long-standing intelligence channels further tied Canadian security to American support. The leverage was tangible, structural, and overwhelmingly one-sided. A country one-tenth the size of the United States had become fully integrated into American economic systems without backup infrastructure, without diversified customer bases, without alternative financial arrangements to reduce dollar dominance, and without independent defense options that didn't rely heavily on U.S. cooperation. Trump reviewed that situation and concluded, quite logically by conventional measures, that Canada had no realistic choice but to accept whatever conditions the United States set. For the opening weeks of the dispute, that assessment appeared entirely correct. Canada absorbed the tariffs. Canada absorbed the demands. Canada absorbed the pressure in the same way smaller nations have always responded to larger ones, by enduring it and hoping the pressure would eventually ease. Yet leverage is never permanent. Leverage arises from dependency, and dependency in turn is shaped by infrastructure. The physical systems determine where goods travel, where money flows, where energy moves, and where minerals are refined. Control the infrastructure, and you control the dependency. Control the dependency, and you control the leverage. It's a matter of physics more than politics, and physics can be changed if you build something different in its place. That is precisely the approach Mark Carney pursued over those 18 months. He didn't waste time debating leverage or filing complaints at international forums. Instead, his team focused on construction, pouring foundations, laying pipelines, finalizing contracts, and establishing new physical, financial, and institutional frameworks that would redirect every stream of Canadian economic activity away from American reliance and toward independent, diversified channels. New liquefied natural gas terminals opened pathways for Canadian gas to reach Pacific markets. Arctic shipping routes provided Canadian crude direct access to European and Asian buyers while bypassing American waters altogether. Domestic processing facilities for critical minerals freed those resources from previous refining dependencies and allowed finished products to ship straight to global customers. Fresh bilateral trade pacts with Japan, South Korea, the European Union, the United Kingdom, India, Mexico, and Australia created viable alternative markets for every category of Canadian export that had once been locked into the U.S. market. Currency swap arrangements with partner central banks reduced reliance on dollar-based transactions. Each initiative represented a concrete infrastructure shift. Each infrastructure shift produced a change in dependency. Each dependency change altered the leverage equation. These adjustments accumulated quietly and steadily until the overall balance tipped in the opposite direction, and Carney stood ready to set the terms. And now Canada has delivered its own ultimatum to the United States, with conditions that form the exact mirror image of what Trump first demanded, roles reversed and leverage inverted. The 5 components are straightforward. The first calls for the immediate and unilateral removal of all American tariffs on Canadian goods, wiping away every levy introduced during the 18-month period without any preconditions, the direct counterpart to Trump's earlier insistence that Canada drop its own retaliatory measures before any talks could begin. The second demands formal acknowledgement of Canada's full sovereignty over its natural resources, with no exclusivity clauses, no priority buyer rights, and no American regulatory involvement in decisions about minerals, energy, or agricultural exports. Canada alone determines destinations, buyers, and pricing, the mirror image of Trump's earlier energy requests that included strict exclusivity provisions. The third establishes an entirely new bilateral trade structure grounded in sovereign equality, with balanced representation in dispute resolution, mutual agreement required for any changes, and no unilateral authority granted to either side, the direct reversal of the previous framework in which the United States acted as both participant and final arbiter. The fourth requires a binding treaty-level pledge that neither country will weaponize economic interdependence in future disagreements. Trade ties, financial systems, energy networks, and supply chains must never again become tools of coercion, the clear counterpoint to the approach taken throughout the preceding 18 months. The fifth involves compensation, a precise dollar amount derived from independent economic studies, covering measurable losses to Canadian businesses, workers, and communities stemming from the tariffs and restrictions. This isn't symbolic. It's presented as a straightforward invoice for damages caused by policies now shown to have breached the foundational terms of the relationship. These conditions aren't radical or overreaching. Analysts who examined them pointed out the same observation again and again. They simply restore the governing principles that defined the US-Canada relationship before the confrontation ever started. Carney isn't seeking Canadian supremacy or American capitulation. He's insisting on the return of sovereign equality, the same balanced status quo that existed before the decision was made to treat the world's largest bilateral trading partnership as something governed by force rather than partnership. The conditions only register as an ultimatum because the United States spent 18 months operating under the belief that sovereign equality was optional, that the bigger economy could unilaterally set the rules, and that the smaller economy had no viable alternatives. The 59-day window proves that assumption was mistaken, and the number 59 itself is what prompted 3 White House economic advisors to call emergency sessions even before Carney finished speaking. 59 isn't a rounded political figure. Political timelines usually land on neat multiples like 30, 60, or 90 to signal flexibility and room for compromise. 59 is a contractual number. It marks the exact remaining days until 7 categories of bilateral supply agreements reach their synchronized contractual expiration. That alignment wasn't accidental. Over the prior 12 months, Carney's government had carefully coordinated the termination dates of commercial contracts between Canadian suppliers and American buyers across all 7 categories. Some agreements were permitted to reach their natural endpoints. Others were renegotiated with matching termination language. Still others were structured so that any renewal would require mutual consent that Canada would now withhold until its conditions were met. The outcome was a perfectly synchronized countdown. 7 supply streams, each governed by enforceable commercial law, each expiring on the identical date, each generating its own crisis that multiplies the impact of the others. Natural gas deliveries to 14 northern states end on day 59. Crude oil shipments to refineries built exclusively around Canadian heavy grades end on day 59. Critical mineral flows to defense contractors and semiconductor producers end on day 59. Hydroelectric power transmitted to connected grids ends on day 59. Lumber supplies for the construction sector end on day 59. Pharmaceutical ingredients and medical isotopes for hospitals and drug makers end on day 59. Each category carries its own replacement timeline, and those timelines explain why the alarm inside the administration is entirely rational. Natural gas could receive partial support through stepped-up domestic output and imported LNG, but the necessary receiving infrastructure in 14 northern states doesn't currently exist and would require 2 to 3 years to construct. That means the first winter after day 59 would bring real supply shortages, felt not just in abstract economic figures, but in higher heating costs and lower thermostat settings for millions of American households. Crude oil switching to non-Canadian grades demands extensive refinery upgrades. Facilities in the Midwest and Gulf Coast are physically optimized for Canadian heavy crude. Converting them to lighter alternatives would cost billions and take 3 to 5 years, during which refining throughput would drop enough to push gasoline prices up by 15 to 25%. Sourcing critical minerals from non-Canadian, non-Chinese suppliers involves mining development and processing plant construction that typically spans 5 to 10 years. The gap between day 60 and functional alternative supplies is measured in years, leaving defense manufacturing, semiconductor production, and electric vehicle assembly facing input shortages with no quick fixes available. Replacing hydroelectric power requires new generation capacity. Constructing power plants takes years. The affected states would confront sustained baseload electricity shortfalls that no existing domestic source could cover on any timeline shorter than half a decade. Lumber can be obtained from other suppliers within months, but only at much higher prices that would immediately raise costs for American home building, an industry already strained by record-high expenses. Agricultural inputs follow seasonal cycles that complicate rapid substitution. Pharmaceutical precursors and medical isotopes face strict regulatory approval timelines that make swift changes not only challenging but potentially risky for patient care. None of these categories can be fully replaced inside 59 days. And because the expirations are simultaneous, tackling one while the others lapse doesn't resolve the situation. It simply piles 6 additional crises atop a partially managed 7th. That deliberate synchronization was the engineering feat, and the engineering became the decisive element. Then the panic truly began. It ignited even before the public statement concluded. According to accounts from 4 administration sources speaking anonymously to 3 different outlets within 48 hours of the announcement, and the National Economic Council held an emergency meeting while Carney was still addressing the press. The gathering ran 4 hours. It generated no concrete plan. It merely clarified the full scale of the challenge, which proved far larger and more urgent than any pre-existing models had anticipated. It also exposed a deeper source of institutional alarm. No contingency planning for a Canadian-initiated ultimatum had ever been undertaken, not under the current administration and not under any prior one. The scenario had never been simulated because it had always been regarded as impossible. Canada simply doesn't issue ultimatums to the United States. That isn't how the relationship is structured. That isn't how unequal power dynamics are supposed to function. Smaller nations do not dictate terms to larger ones, except when the smaller nation has quietly spent 18 months constructing the exact structural foundation required to do so, while the larger nation remained focused on its own offensive moves and overlooked the defensive transformation happening next door. 3 competing policy proposals emerged in those first 48 hours, and the rivalry among them quickly created its own form of gridlock. The first, pushed by the Trade Representatives team, recommended accepting Canada's terms without delay, lifting the tariffs, acknowledging sovereignty, and entering the new framework. The reasoning was practical and backed by clear numbers. The leverage had evaporated, the clock was running, and 59 days could not be ignored. The economic pain of refusal, measured in energy price surges, supply chain breakdowns, defense delays, and agricultural losses, far outweighed the cost of agreement. The second proposal, advanced by the national security faction, called for escalated countermeasures, fresh sanctions, tighter financial restrictions, and an emergency executive order pouring billions into accelerated domestic production. The logic was ideological. Yielding to a smaller nation's deadline would set a dangerous global precedent and erode America's international standing. If Canada could impose terms on the United States, anyone could. The cost of acceptance wasn't dollars. It was the lasting erosion of American influence. The third approach, favored by the State Department, suggested diplomatic efforts to extend the deadline, quiet outreach to Ottawa, mediation through allies such as the United Kingdom or Japan, and a face-saving arrangement allowing both sides to claim the timeline had been mutually revised, while the White House gained breathing room to formulate a coherent response. The reasoning was procedural. More time was essential to evaluate options, run new models, and develop choices that didn't yet exist. The fundamental difficulty with these 3 proposals was that each one rendered the other 2 impossible. Accepting the terms at once destroyed the National Security Group's credibility and removed any basis for the State Department to request an extension. You cannot seek additional time to consider conditions you have already embraced. Escalating with new sanctions eliminated both acceptance and diplomatic delay, because you cannot punish a partner while simultaneously asking for patience and signaling compliance. Requesting an extension required indicating eventual willingness to accept the terms, which undermined the escalatory option while also signaling that acceptance hadn't occurred yet, thereby weakening the pragmatists who insisted that every extra day of delay only brought the deadline closer without advancing any solution. The 3 proposals didn't complement each other.